In this lecture, we're going to get into how bones actually grow, right? So you all were at one point very short little humans, and then you hit your growth spurt probably 12, 13, 14 years old, and you probably shot up a few inches. And when that happened, you might even remember it hurting a little bit. If you grew like a few inches in 1 year, you might remember at night like pain in your bones, at the ends of your bones. And that's because your bones are literally stretching in length, and that's going to cause some pain, right? You're pulling on all the nerves, you're pulling on the tendons and the ligaments. So how does that happen? How does your bone actually grow in length? And it happens at a point in the bone which we call the epiphyseal disc, or the epiphyseal plate, or growth plate is what it's commonly called. So if you remember in the last lecture, we talked about the fact that bone forms two different ways: intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. And what makes endochondral ossification so important and different is it actually has two different ossification centers. As the bones are developing, the diaphysis converts to bone first. It goes from cartilage to bone, right? It goes hyaline cartilage to bone. And then there's a secondary ossification center that forms in the epiphyses. And what you end up with is right before you're born, you end up with your bone formed at the epiphysis. You have the end of the bone, which is going to be bone, and you have the diaphysis, which is bone, but you get this thin strip of cartilage that gets left behind, which is called the epiphyseal disc, or the epiphyseal plate. And that's what we're seeing right here in this image. So I just want to refer to this diagram real quick. What you should see here is there's a definite distinction between this top area, which is pink, and this middle area here, which is purple. And what you're seeing is the pink is bone and the purple is cartilage. So what we're looking at right here is actually a zoomed in image of the epiphyseal plate. So just to give you a reference point, if this was a bone, this would be the epiphysis up top. So we'd have our epiphysis up here. And then this would be the top of the diaphysis, which would become the shaft of the bone. And what you'll notice here is if you look at the epiphyseal plate, which is this entire area here is the epiphyseal disc or epiphyseal plate. What you should hopefully see is there are some distinct zones. There's actually 4 distinct zones that have different things going on, and that's what I'm going to go through in this lecture today. I'm going to explain what's happening in each one of these zones, and we're going to talk a little bit about why it's important, and hopefully it'll make some sense. So let's get started. So what is this whole thing all about? Well, the epiphyseal disc is the area of growth which separates the epiphysis from the diaphysis, and there are 4 distinct layers. So again, just to make sure we understand, this area right here, this line of purple, this is the border between the diaphysis, so this would be the diaphysis here, and up here would be the epiphysis. So this is the growth plate right here. This is the epiphyseal disc. And there are 4 layers. So let's get started. The first layer is considered the resting layer. It's called the layer of rest, or the resting zone, and what it's made up of is a thin band of hyaline cartilage. This is not really doing anything, but it's important. So if you take a look at it, here, it should look similar to when you did that lab, when you looked at hyaline cartilage. You can notice we have our lacunae here, you can see the individual chondrocytes, and then in between we have this glassy, collagen-rich matrix, which is going to make up hyaline cartilage. So this is what's called the resting zone. Now, why is this resting zone important? The reason why this resting zone even exists is because it holds the epiphysis to the diaphysis. If the resting zone wasn't there, the top of the bone would just pop right off. So think of the resting zone as the anchor that holds the epiphysis to the diaphysis. So it doesn't add any length, it doesn't actually grow, but it is the part of the epiphyseal plate which attaches the top of the bone to the diaphysis. So if this zone were not here, your epiphysis would just fall right off of your diaphysis and we'd be in big trouble. So the resting zone is made up of hyaline cartilage, and it is not really doing anything other than anchoring the epiphysis to the diaphysis. The second zone is a lot more active. This is called the zone of proliferation, or the reproduction zone. So let's take a look at what's happening here. What you can see here are a bunch of, these are all chondrocytes, these are cartilage cells, and they're stacked up. If you take a look at them, they're stacked up, and they're packed in tight. And what's happening here is these cells are undergoing a very, very high rate of mitosis. So these cells are dividing, and they're dividing quickly. And what ends up happening is when they divide, they add more and more, and what you end up with is this zone right here is going to increase in length. Now, we're not in the classroom right now, but imagine you were in the classroom, and think of your standard classroom. Your desks are in rows, right? So you have people in front of you and people behind you, and then there's a row next to you with a bunch of people. Now, imagine if I was in this classroom and I just started adding desks to the rows. what's going to happen is the rows are going to get longer, right? So if you're sitting in a desk and somebody adds a desk in front of you, you're going to get pushed back. So over time, if I keep adding desks, those rows are going to get longer and longer and longer. That is exactly what is happening here in the zone of proliferation or the reproduction zone. You have these little chondrocytes that are just starting to reproduce like crazy, and you're going to get them adding up. So imagine a stack of pancakes, and you keep throwing in more and more pancakes. More and more pancakes get added, that stack's going to get longer. So this is the part of the bone that actually grows. So this is cartilage still, and those chondrocytes are getting larger. They're not getting larger, they're packing in and they're spreading apart, and what you end up with is this zone where the bone gets longer. So that is called the zone of proliferation. So just to review the slide, we have our resting zone up top, which is just made up of hyaline cartilage, and that is anchoring the epiphysis to the diaphysis. And then we have, this is really where the magic happens. This is the part of the bone that actually grows. So this is where the growth is occurring, and the reason why it's happening is because those cells are reproducing very quickly, and that is the zone of proliferation. Okay, the next zone is where things start to get a little weird. Okay, so let's take a look down here at this zone. If you look in this area right here, what you'll notice is, hopefully, you'll see that these cells are starting to get a little bit bigger. So here they're packed in tight, but down here they get a little bit bigger. And they also are getting a little bit more spread out. You'll notice there's more matrix in between them. And this is called the zone of maturation. And that is because these chondrocytes are growing and they're getting older and they're doing what we talked about before. If you remember what chondrocytes do, they build a lacunae around themselves. And this lacunae thickens and eventually they die. So what are we seeing here? What we're seeing is these cells are expanding, and then what are we looking at right here? You're seeing a thin band of empty rooms. These are, it's sad, but these are the empty lacunae that get left behind by the dying chondrocytes. So these chondrocytes die, and when they die, they expand. And when they expand, they push the cell outwards, and you get these open rooms that get left behind. So let me just focus on a couple things in this zone, because this zone is where a lot of important things happen. First of all, they make a special kind of collagen that only exists in this part of the body. And this collagen accumulates calcium, which is not normal. Normally, cartilage doesn't have calcium. Normally, cartilage is just made up of collagen, and it's rubbery. It's like it's a shock absorber. In this case, this collagen has a little calcium in it. And what that does is it makes the walls even thicker, and these cells die. And when they die, they do something very interesting. They push outwards. And there's still not a good understanding of why and how that happens, at least not for me. Maybe at the highest levels of education, they've done research and they understand it better. But everything I know about this process is that these cells, they expand, they push outwards, and then they die. And what they leave behind are these empty rooms. So just to quickly review, our resting zone is sitting up top, not really doing a whole lot except for keeping this thing held together. Then we have our zone of proliferation, which is right here. And that is when these cells are just doubling up, and that is lengthening that part of the bone. And then finally, in the third phase, we have what's called the zone of maturation, and this is where these cells are expanding outwards, they're dying, and what they're leaving behind are these empty rooms, essentially. So this is kind of sad to think about it, but I've used this analogy before. Imagine an old person that lives in a house, and they die. When they die, that house doesn't go away. The house remains there. And eventually someone else is going to move into that house and make that house their own. And that is what the fourth zone is all about. So the third zone is the maturation. These cells start to divide, or they start to mature, they grow outwards, and then they die. And when they die, they leave these empty rooms behind. And then we have our final zone here, which is considered the zone of ossification or the zone of degeneration. And what's happening here is, you can see it, osteoblasts come in. So osteoblasts come in and they start to convert that cartilage into bone, just like in endochondral ossification. They convert that cartilage into a bone material, so everything down below this point becomes bone. So this whole entire process has 4 stages. The first phase, or the first zone I should say, is the zone of rest, and up here nothing's really happening. It's just holding that bone to the cartilage, so the epiphysis is anchored to the diaphysis. We have our second zone, which is the zone of proliferation or zone of growth, and that is going to be where the cells are replicating and stacking up and growing in length. Then we have our zone of maturation, and that is where these chondrocytes are dying. they're building their very thick lacunae, adding calcium to it, which is not normal, and making these thick walls that cause them to suffocate. When they die, they leave behind these empty rooms. And then the fourth zone, which you're seeing right down here, is these little dots. I don't know if you guys can see them, but these little dots are osteoblasts. They come in and they build new bone in that area, and they convert that cartilage into bone. So everything below here is going to be bone. So when you think of your growth plate is growing from that area of cartilage, and it's expanding bigger and bigger, and that process is going to continue until you're around 21 years old. So basically, your bones will continue to lengthen. So if you look here, you can see, I can tell that this is somebody that's under the age of like 23, 24, because you can still see the growth plates there. You can still see the epiphyseal disc. So that happens till around then. At that point, though, they calcify and they become completely bone. So my x-ray would look different than this. My x-ray, you would not see that line. One thing, though, that does continue to happen is your bones will continue to thicken under the periosteum. So your periosteum still has osteoblasts below it, and those bones will thicken depending on usage, right? So I talked about that. If you exercise or have any stress on that bone, that is going to trigger osteoblasts to thicken that bone. So if you're an athlete, you're going to be somebody that has thicker bones than somebody who is not an athlete. That's why football players can handle the impact that they are under. If I tried to go out on a football field, I would get destroyed because my bones can't handle that. But if you're regularly training, your bones are going to thicken and you can handle that level of impact. Also, what you end up with is hyaline cartilage remains at the ends of the bone, and that is going to be that articulating cartilage. So even though the cartilage goes away at the epiphyseal disc, the cartilage at the end of the bone is going to stay. Thank you very much. It's happening at both ends of the bone. And that's it. Thank you very much.